Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Welcome to this very special film premiere and conversation with the filmmakers of Current Revolution, Nation in Transition. This special premiere is presented by Arizona State University and the American Resilience Project, and we will be beginning that just shortly, allowing some time for more participants to join us. Please note that the Q&A functionality is on, and so if you have questions that come up either through the duration of the film or afterwards doing our Q&A, please submit those there. We will also have a quick poll at the close of the film screening, so please look for that. Thank you, and we'll begin shortly. Please welcome our filmmakers to do the introduction, Roger Sorkin and Paul Hurt.
Thank you, Jason. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Roger Sorkin. I'm the director of the American Resilience Project, which is a mission-driven film production nonprofit. This film, Nation in Transition, is the second in our Current Revolution Energy Transition film series. And the series is designed as a set of convening and educational tools for helping us navigate the complexity of these transitions. And because of this complexity, and because energy is embedded in just about every aspect of our human existence, our solution set has to go way beyond just the technological advances. And fortunately, we're doing pretty well on the technology front, but we need to understand how changing our energy system really affects every other aspect of our lives. And so the foundation for this process should begin, and yes, I am biased as a filmmaker, but I think it's true, with stories that connect with us emotionally, stories that everyone can relate to. In other words, a strategic narrative. And so my hope after you watch this film is that you'll have a clearer understanding, not only of the urgency around accelerating our energy transition, but that it will also increase your confidence that we can actually get our arms around this, that we all have a role to play, and that this film and the subsequent films in the series will help accelerate these transitions and help us navigate them. So I'd like to extend a quick thank you to our executive producers, John Martinson and Grace Taswell, the Arizona Community Foundation, the many faculty, staff, and departments at Arizona State University who helped make this film possible, the American Resilience Project Board of Directors and Advisors, and of course, last and certainly not least, the people and government of the Navajo Nation, including the Navajo Nation TV and Film Office, which helped us complete the filming when COVID prevented our return to the Navajo Nation for the final film shoot. And with that, I'd like to introduce ASU Professor Emeritus Paul Hurt, who played a critical role in the creation of this film as co-writer and co-producer. Paul?
Thank you, Roger, and thanks everybody for joining us today. We've got well over 300 people already online and more coming every second, so that's amazing. It's amazing to be at this point. After 2 years of working on this film, to see it ready for public reveal is just very exciting. As Roger mentioned, I'm a former professor at ASU. I recently retired this year, and I consider this work on films for public engagement to be something that I'm doing my sort of meaningful work in retirement, and it's been a real pleasure. A lot of people helped Roger and I get to this point, too many to actually name here. So I encourage everybody to watch the credits that roll at the end of the film to see the names of everybody who contributed to this project and to getting us to this point. I especially, however, want to thank my colleagues at ASU, especially colleagues and staff in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. That was the academic unit that I taught in for the last 16 years before I retired. And they provided a tremendous amount of logistical as well as moral support. And the Public History Endowment in that school provided financial support for this project. And financial support also came from the Narrative Storytelling Initiative run by Stephen Beschloss in the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at ASU. So I want to thank them in particular for their financial support as well as strategic and moral support. While I'm doing thanks, I want to thank Roger Sorkin for actually inviting me along on this adventure. I first met Roger when he was working on the previous film, the first episode in this series called Current Revolution. And I ended up being interviewed and became a talking head in that film. And afterwards, Roger and I began working together. I joined his steering committee and help to sort of suggest the outlines of this project that you'll be watching today. So it's been a great learning experience, Roger, and I really honor the opportunity to be able to work with you. After the film is over, we're going to have a question and answer session, and we'll be joined, Roger and I will be joined on a panel by Edward D., who's the executive director of the Office of Navajo Government Development, which is part of the Navajo Nation Council. He appears in the film. You'll see him several times in the film. He's joining us on the panel afterwards. And that panel is going to be hosted and moderated by one of my favorite people at ASU, Kris Mayes, professor in sustainability. And she was also a law professor. And she was also the chairwoman of the Arizona Corporation Commission that regulates electric utilities in the state of Arizona, one of the nation's leading experts on electricity regulation and renewable energy. She's going to be leading the Q&A. So when we come back from the film, she'll be jumping in and taking over during the question and answer session. I think that's it. Did I miss anything, Jason or Roger? All right, I think we're ready for the film then. We now have 360 people on board, so let it roll, Jason.
It takes a lot of water to produce our energy. It takes a lot of energy to move our water. There's a total lift of about 2,000 feet with a dozen or so separate pumping plants to do that lift. The canal is 300 some miles long as it comes into Phoenix and then heads south to Tucson. And it is the largest user of electricity in the state of Arizona. We need to pump water 24 hours a day, whether the sun is shining or not. And coal provided that reliability.
For half a century, coal has been one of the cheapest forms of electricity available. It's no longer so cheap. The shift to clean energy in electric vehicles is already happening, and it's happening faster than anyone expected. Now our task is to manage that transition to ensure that it is both just and sustainable.
There's a lot of economic prosperity that's going to come along with this transformation, but there are going to be costs. Some whole categories of jobs are just going to disappear.
Take a new job far from home, or face unemployment. That's the decision facing hundreds of employees of the Navajo Generating Station.
Last year, officials from the Navajo Nation and Salt River Project decided to shut down the plant.
It is emotional. A lot of people, when they lose their livelihood, it's like losing a loved one. That meal is not there no more. The payment for the mortgage or the payment for the vehicle, those are all gone.
Our daily routines and habits, all the way up to the way we organize geopolitics, the way we distribute wealth and power in the world, are wrapped up in this thing that we call the energy system. So when we change it, we're going to get changes in everything else at the same time. We need to start learning now, and we need to learn at a pace and a scale that we've never learned before.
Like 1940, there's only 400,000 people, population in the state of Arizona. Now we got 7 million people. For 50 years now, we gave low-cost energy and power for the state of Arizona so they could have what they have now. We didn't profit from it.
For decades, a large portion of the Navajo Nation's income has derived from coal royalties. Coal that was mined here and used to produce energy for Phoenix, Vegas, and California didn't yield a quality of life that the people in Phoenix, Vegas, and California enjoy.
The raw resources, Navajo resources, were purchased at low prices, rock bottom prices. Navajo water from the upper basin Colorado River was used to help with the operation of the Navajo Generating Station. We waived our rights to claim any of that water for the duration of the power plant, and we never got any payment for it.
There used to be a lot of water around here. We didn't have to travel a distance to get water. So I would say that we spent more money for our water than people that have running water. Because we had to buy gas, we had wear and tear on our vehicle to get water from the chapter house and haul them back for our drinking water or for our livestock. I'm glad that they're shutting it down. But we would like to see them to fix it the way it was before. And they just can't leave it like that and leave.
I'm 50 years old and these guys are just now leaving. And I've spent the prime of my life battling the pollution here and not being able to herd sheep on my family ancestral land and not being able to farm here. And so I never got a chance to use any of this land.
The plant was built when I was in high school. My dad was hired by SRP to work at the plant. So it was important to our family that he was employed there, and it was a good thing for us. I started at SRP in 1979 as an operator trainee. Once the plant was built and people were employed there, I think we thought it was just going to be there forever. There was no thought that it was ever going to close down. People had raised their families there. It just seemed like part of the community. So the news of shutting it down really was a shock, I think, to everyone. It was just unexpected. I had always thought I was going to retire there, but word came down that we weren't going to be economically viable anymore.
As much as the Navajo Nation has depended on the coal in this operation, it has never really brought prosperity to the nation, and it has never really taken the nation out of the high unemployment rate that persists even today.
I'm a union iron worker for local ironworkers 433 in LA. So it's a ways from here to find work, but that's the only place I can find work. Nothing around here for us. So you got the mine and the plant, there's only 600 workers, but there's 300,000 of us. And then where do they find work? There's no work at home. So you got mom and dads having to travel that far away to find work, and you got your kids at home with grandma, grandpas, and having the whole nation 50% unemployed, and then you got 60% of people in poverty.
What we're confronted with now is declining government resources and a larger population to sustain. The great opportunity here is to invest in solar or wind for communities that have bore the brunt and the adverse impacts of extraction, but never received the appropriate compensation for giving up land, water, cultural or religious resources that may be contaminated forever. It's critical that we chart a new path defined by our traditional values, being able to have a family, your animals, and multi-generations living in the community you've always lived in. And at the same time, participate in the modern world and in the community of nations.
I think we have a design challenge. The way that we design the ownership of that energy, the geography of that energy, the way that we design the markets, it is the opportunity of a century to build a low carbon future that does more for us than just replace the energy system that we have with a new one. And that's one of the things we can start learning with what's happening here in Arizona around the Navajo Nation, because we've never tried to do anything like this on this scale, this complexity, this deeply integrated into our human systems.
We have a long and not so great relationship with the federal government, not to mention all the other entities that have come on and off the Navajo Nation. We're still a sovereign nation. And when we say sovereign, that means we can determine our own destiny. It's not only a trust issue between the Navajo people and outside entities. It's a trust issue between we as well as the Navajo government and our Navajo communities. We're a big government. We have about 300,000 members, and that means we have to build consensus among our own Navajo people and our own communities. If you don't have a total buy-in of the whole community, the discontent with one stakeholder who's not happy with the process, their discontent kind of grows and it starts reaching into other parts of the community, and pretty soon you don't have that buy-in. There's no trust of the process anymore, and people feel left out.
We collectively need to win. I don't give a damn which party wins. I want answers. When a conflict arises, that ability to pick up the phone and call the city manager and say, this is what my attorneys are telling me, and that we need to go to court with you. What are your attorneys telling you? And can we kick the attorneys out of the room and solve this problem? That's essential.
Arizona Public Service Company has been the largest provider of electricity in the state of Arizona for more than 100 years. We operate 2 coal-fired power plants, one in northeastern Arizona, and that's the Cholla Power Plant. And that plant is slated to close in 2025. And we announced that closure in 2015. It is really important to start planning before there are plans to formally close the plant and start talking about what will happen when the plant closes. It is never too early to begin these conversations. So you would have regulators and legislators at the table, you would have your Public Utility Commission representatives at the table, environmental groups, faith groups, labor organizations, and then obviously the electric utility. And a lot of these folks bring different perspectives, and that's one of the challenges in this space is figuring out how to reconcile those perspectives.
You can't over-communicate. We're beginning to think about other power plants that we have. What's the transition that we want to help those communities with now, even if they may not close for another 7-8 years? Begin those discussions, because these transitions take a long time. We made a commitment to the Navajo Nation overall to make this transition work. And so I think there's opportunities to do it no matter if you're an investor-owned utility, public power utility, or a co-op utility.
In the case of SRP, they provided information to the community about timelines. They announced that they were going to actually offer jobs to all of the employees. And that was a huge thing. I can't even believe they did that. If I were not offered another job within SRP, I don't know what I would have done.
Providing this level of support, providing these resources will help to contribute to a vibrant economy here in Arizona. And that is so important for our business success. And so we've got every confidence that this will be beneficial not just for our customers and our employees, but also for our shareholders.
We have reclaimed mine areas. You got Navajo Mine and McKinley Mine near Gallup. Then you got Kayenta and Black Mesa Mine. 3 areas that we can build off to build solar fields. And then we got power lines coming through our homeland. We can light up the city of Phoenix, Tucson.
The negotiations between the utilities and the Navajo Nation has left the Navajo Nation with a certain amount of assets from the Navajo Generating Station. The Navajo Nation was able to get the water pumps at the generating station. The Navajo Nation was able to get 500 megawatts of transmission lines committed to them from the Bureau of Reclamations. So those are really significant.
The biggest question was, if we have transmission lines and power generating facilities on the Navajo Nation, why are there still Navajo people out there without electricity? A lot of the times people already live where they live. They live in their ancestral areas. They've grown up there for generations, and that's where they want to be. Every community has a group of people who don't have electricity, they don't have water. It's really expensive to run power lines, and so renewable energy really offers those local solutions.
NTUA made a decision a number of years ago to start to develop renewable energy within the reservation, recognizing the abundance of renewable energy available here. We hired approximately 250 local Navajo and trained them. Many of them have gone on to work at other plants and continue to build. Now that they're built, they're providing energy for the local area, reasonably priced and reliable. In addition to that, we sell renewable energy credits to others outside of the Navajo Nation, and the revenue from that goes directly back to construct lines to those folks that currently don't have electric power within the nation.
The COVID-19 death toll continues to rise in the U.S. Fear is mounting the spread of the virus could devastate tribal communities.
I think one of the reasons why we were so impacted on the Navajo Nation with COVID is the fact that you have a lot of people not having access to things as simple as information. A lot of the information was spread through the internet. And when you don't have electricity, you don't have computers, you don't have TV, you don't have satellite, now you're kind of limited to if you get radio signal, if you get cell service. It also limits the storage of their food. This requires them, if they don't have electricity, to go and get ice. If their stores were closed, they were going further out and further out. And so they would have to go to the border towns when our stores weren't open. A lot of our relatives have respiratory issues and they have challenges with the air quality. That being compounded by a virus that attacks that exact thing really affected people that were already in a disadvantaged position. And so owning that process going forward in energy development for us is what we feel is needed in order for us to make sure we don't go down those same paths again. Out of college, I returned back home and I really was looking to create jobs and solve issues for my people. We looked at how we could form a company that would develop projects that we feel are in tune with the cultural and the local values. And we feel like we brought some of those values from Silicon Valley with fundraising and capital investment and markets into the nation, so that we can utilize those resources and those allies to be able to develop our projects.
Now what do we got?
Check that. So reverse your polarity on your leads there and then remeasure. And guess what's going to happen to my charge controller?
Negative.
Right, you see that negative on there?
Okay. We're here in Hard Rock, Arizona, doing our very first solar training, and it's a 6 to 8 week program. We have about 10 Native students who are participating. And this is really a huge effort for us to invest in the Native community and be able to employ our own people to provide off-grid power for families that need it. One of the goals of the workforce training programs that we have here is to prepare and empower local Native people to go into the solar workforce. That doesn't necessarily have to be here on the reservation, and they don't necessarily have to be installers, but we do want to give them the tools to succeed out in the renewable energy world. A lot of the applicants knew or have relatives and family that don't have electricity, so they want to be able to install their own system and know how to maintain it.
This is an immense opportunity for us to think about what traditional indigenous governance works, and it should be established between Indian tribes and not dependent on the federal government. Then we will be able to demonstrate to tribes across the country how they can work collectively to achieve our goals as people who are indigenous to the United States, but not dependent on it to prosper.
There's no model or template for how to do this. We are making this up as we go. But we do believe that it is our social responsibility to ensure that we help these legacy coal communities whose contributions were critical to the success that we experience today, and really for the economy that our nation is built on. This is because of people who have done hard work in coal mines and coal plants. And we owe them a debt of gratitude, ensuring that we don't leave them behind as we make this transition that we have to make. We cannot leave them behind.
Historically, energy has been one of the unfortunate drivers of inequality. Energy is deeply wrapped up in how we distribute wealth in the world. It takes money from all of us to pay for our fuels and our electricity, and it sends it off into the hands of a much smaller array of people and institutions and organizations. We could do a better job of designing that so that the energy system actually works the other way. It becomes a generator of economic security that helps alleviate poverty. It becomes a generator of income.
If we get this transition in northern Arizona right, we can take all the lessons from that and apply them to many other transitions that we'll be facing in the years to come. Like the electric vehicle transformation, we're going to need a transition plan and transition assistance for that to take care of the jobs and the communities that are dependent on the old internal combustion engine that is going to be going away shortly. And the transition that coal communities are facing today are going to be faced by natural gas communities. We're going to start seeing communities suffering from the loss of natural gas fracking, natural gas processing activities, and the power plants that are run on natural gas.
The biggest question is, do we have the political will to come together and govern ourselves? That is where we have our biggest problem. If we fail to do so, I think we as a country certainly won't be a global leader anymore. And globally, if we as a species fail to face these things, I think we do face some dire consequences. What that means for us long term, it's hard to say. But, you know, the world will go on. It existed before we were here as a species, and it will exist regardless of where we go. We may leave it damaged behind us, but it will survive us.
How do we ensure that these things exist for our kids into the future? To me, it's that simple. I want to make sure that I have said what I need to say and have done what I needed to do. And that way, at least the future generations will never say to me, why didn't you speak up for me? And, you know, I'll never be to blame. There's nothing that beats a clean conscience, I don't think.
Well, what a fantastic, remarkable film, and so completely moving. Everyone, thank you again for being on with us. I'm Kris Mayes. You see a poll here on your screen. Please go ahead and take that poll while it's up, and then we will provide the results once you have done that, and get started with our panel discussion. So while we are waiting for that to appear, I think it's going to appear in a few seconds here. I want to just start with our panelists and just launch in. And before I do that, let me also say, please go ahead and put any questions that you have for our panelists based on this film in the chat, in the Q&A. And I will do my best to get to as many of your questions as I possibly can, because I think that should be our focus. But, Paul, let me start with you. You have had many experiences in your life, and now you've had the opportunity to help make this remarkable movie about this energy transition that is occurring on the Navajo Nation. But you also served on the board of directors of the Salt River Project, which is one of the utilities that did operate the Navajo Generating Station. One of the things that we saw in this film was the growing recognition by utilities that they do have an obligation to help the Navajo Nation and other coal impacted communities make this transition. What do you think that obligation is on the part of utilities?
That's a good question. And it could lead to a lot of detailed specific policy proposals, which I think I won't get into the weeds on, but sort of keep the perspective large. I think the most important thing that utilities need to do is to recognize, as this film highlights in the case of SRP and APS, utilities need to recognize that they have an obligation to the workers in the communities who have been supported by the legacy fossil fuel energy infrastructure, and that they can't just sort of close up shop and walk away. Our sort of default position in a kind of a unregulated capitalist economy, the default position is, if a business isn't making money anymore, or a product isn't making a profit, you stop making the product and move on. We need to do a certain amount of that, but in a system that is as central to our lives, to our health, to our economy, to the functioning of our entire modern society, the energy system is absolutely central and crucial. And for 100 years, we have been designing and fine-tuning that system. It's not just, a product that can sink in rise or sink in a free market. It is an essential technological system that's completely embedded in our society. And it didn't just sort of evolve organically. It was designed, it was built intentionally and rebuilt constantly over time to meet social goals. The three main social goals that our energy system has always met are affordability, access, and reliability. But we can ask our energy system to serve many more functions than that. We haven't adequately asked our energy system to be clean and healthy. We haven't adequately asked our energy system to provide benefits to a broader sweep of the public, to stop concentrating wealth and start distributing wealth, to make sure, that more and more people can, as this film showed, there are so many people who have fallen through the cracks, who are outside the system. 40% of Navajo families on the Navajo Nation don't even have access to running water and electricity. How can that be in the 21st century? So we, utilities and everybody else, need to recognize that our energy system is intentionally produced, it is designed, and it's going through a major reorganization now, the most significant, most fundamental restructuring in the 120 years since the invention of electricity. And as Clark Miller said in the film, that gives us an enormous opportunity. And we should think carefully, number one, about where we want to go in the future with our energy system. And number two, as this film emphasizes, who's losing out in this transition and how do we bring them along? How do we not let them fall through the cracks and be left behind?
Great, thank you, Paul. And Ed D, let me come to you with this one. You are in the middle of working on this transition. You're a member of the Navajo Nation. You're an official there at the Navajo Nation. Can you talk to us about what some of the near-term achievable objectives, goals, projects are that you think we can be working on, the nation can be working on, utilities can be working on, to help the nation right now? Because it's clear from this film that the Navajo Nation and the Hopi Nation are experiencing immediate impacts from the closure of NGS. The Navajo Nation, for instance, I believe the statistic has lost $50 million a year in revenue, an enormous amount, and the Hopi 80% of their revenue. So what are some near-term attainable projects or goals we could be headed toward?
Well, thank you, Kris, and hello, everyone out there. Thank you, Roger and Paul, for this film, a great film. Although I can't speak for the Hopi tribe, of course, I can only speak for Navajo to some extent. I think a great place to start is an attitude, is a position or a perspective. Now, I really like what Delegate Carl Slater mentioned in the film, that to chart a new path. And so I think that's basically where we need to begin with, is to have that mindset, to have that understanding, to have that principled view and position to say, hey, we now realize that the coal-powered fire plant fueled by the mines up on Black Mesa has come and gone. So I remember sitting in the 23rd Navajo Nation Council here about 3.5 years ago. They're debating on negotiating, or at least extending the lease. And I'm sitting there listening to the 23rd Navajo Nation Council. Oh my God, what have they gotten themselves into? This is non-attainable, non-feasible. But that's then and now. Some of the immediate thing I think that's relevant here is a legislation that was introduced by Delegate Slater here last summer, which is basically it pursuing the partnership with the City of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. I think that's feasible, that's still there. And I think that's where we need to really pick up the pieces. That's one area. And then prior to that legislation was another legislation by a delegate from southwestern part of the Navajo Nation, Elmer Begay, introduced legislation 0073, which was really to embrace renewable energy. So we have Navajo leadership who are a part of what we call the 24th Navajo Nation Council that at least recognize that. And then Speaker Damien, of course, has fully embraced the need to transition in not just energy, but energy being the focal point, but in other areas of sustainability. So there's some positive area to highlight, as well as the committee of the Navajo Nation Council, the Resource Development Committee, has begun talking about putting together an energy summit that will bring experts within the region as well as across the country, to bring experts to have this really open-ended, face-to-face conversation about the need to make this transition. So in my last contact with the speaker's staff, they're still pursuing that. Of course, COVID has put a stop on a lot of things. And then lastly is with our office, the Office of Government Development, as well as the Commission on Government Development. You mentioned that, of course, we work very closely with the delegates. We put together a white paper that just was passed by the commission here 2 weeks ago. And the title of the paper is A Case for Understanding Navajo Sustainability. Subtitle, COVID-19 Pandemic Presents Unique Opportunities. And in that 27-page report, we highlighted what Paul, Dr. Hurt just mentioned earlier, is the EV transition. And we highlighted that in this piece that we'll get it public here in about a couple of weeks or so. There is a huge need to also address transportation on Navajo. One, on the local level, the lifestyle, and also transportation, the mobility with respect to Navajo Nation fleet and other governmental fleet. And the fact that there is an MOU out there. Every state surrounding Navajo Nation, there are 8 Western states that are signatories onto this MOU about transitioning into EV. Navajo is not there. So these are opportunities, I think, that are reachable and attainable. Thank you, Kris.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And I would add, we work a lot also with, here at ASU, we work with President Nez's office and President Nez himself, and he has done, I think, a fantastic job negotiating the package with APS that Ann Becker in this film talked about. And I think it's a groundbreaking, nation-leading economic package that was negotiated around Four Corners closure and Cholla closure. And I believe it's actually worth north of $200 million. And under that package that President Nez negotiated, the Navajo Nation will get 600 megawatts of renewable energy purchases from APS, about $100 million in direct cash relief if the Corporation Commission approves it, and $10 million for electrification projects on the Navajo Nation, among other things. So there are very concrete actions, I think, that we need to be expecting of our utilities going forward. Roger, let me move to you. You've done a number of films under your series, A Current Revolution, especially around these themes of transition and equity in the transition. So can you just sort of compare for me what you saw and found in this film? And then a secondary question for you would be, what surprised you about the time that you spent on the Navajo Nation making this movie?
Thanks, Kris. Yeah, so equity is a major theme, I think, that runs through this, and I think it's probably a unifying theme that, when we look at our political situation right now, and trying to, I guess, take the temperature down. And get everybody to somehow have a seat at the table. I think the real unifying factor here is jobs. Everybody wants to create jobs in their district. Every elected official, that's the way they measure their success, and it's what they run on or they get attacked for when it comes time to run again for their seat. And so, I think the idea of workers, job opportunities is just one of those storylines that I think is unavoidable. And any narrative that we put out there with regards to the energy transition that doesn't address head on this question of job opportunity is really just going to fall flat. And one of the things about, I just want to pick up on something real quick that Ed mentioned about transportation. One of the next films that we have in the series is looking specifically about the electric vehicle transformation, but from the perspective of the auto dealership world, which is not necessarily what most people think about when they think, how are we going to transform our economy to accommodate a transition to electric vehicles? I think policymakers, they often think about, well, what about purchasing incentives for those cars? Or do we have enough charging stations? One of the ideas that one of our advisors, Bill Stetson at American Resilience Project and I are working on now, and the executive producer for for Nation in Transition, John Martinson and I are putting our heads together on is what is going to happen to auto dealerships. And when you look at the fact that the dealerships make more money on service than they do on sales, and electric vehicles have less service requirement than internal combustion engine, add on top of that, that our training platforms for auto mechanics are vocational schools, the military, and prisons. And we have a high level of former prison inmates working as auto mechanics. There really begs a lot of questions there around equity. What happens to the social fabric, the workers at these dealerships? What's going to happen if we just suddenly impose all of these policies that say, you can't sell internal combustion engine vehicles anymore? So I think the technological questions are the easy ones. It's more the social questions that are the thornier ones for us to get our minds around. So, and then, quickly, with regards to the surprises, I don't know that I was surprised, other than the fact that, COVID threw us a curveball in the middle of this production. So we started filming before COVID came along. We expected to go back in April of 2020, but we couldn't. And I think if you had mentioned it to me that there is a public health connection with regards to energy access, I would have thought, okay, well, of course, that makes sense. But what I really was stark for me, and it still is whenever I hear the statistic about so many homes in the Navajo Nation lacking access to electricity and water, that became crystal clear for me, that COVID was made worse by the fact that electricity is less accessible. And I think that we really need to factor in the public health component to the energy transition, no matter where we're taking it on.
Could not agree more. Absolutely. On that point, Jason, can we post the results from the poll real quickly? All right, 87% of our viewers are very motivated to advocate for policies that would support a just transition away from coal. Somewhat motivated, 13%, and very, very few not motivated at all. So that's good to see. Great, I'm glad. So let's use that as a springboard. Let me go to the questions from our audience. One audience member asked, what are the major obstacles against the transition from coal and gas to clean energy? Is it technological, political, or social and cultural? Paul, do you want to take that first, and anyone else? Paul, you're on mute.
Yeah, the answer to the question is actually embedded in the question itself. It's a little bit of all of them. It's some technological, some economic, some political and social. I think you can maybe summarize it as inertia, and that's not inertia from not caring. It's inertia from the infrastructure that we have already built and invested in and designed the system around. A lot of that still has to be paid off. There's an awful lot of jobs and buildings and power lines and everything else around it. We just can't abandon one of the largest infrastructure systems in the world. If we come up with a new way of designing a better energy infrastructure, it has to roll out incrementally. And we have to think carefully about what are we replacing and what are we going to do with all of that legacy infrastructure. Like the power plants have to come down. They're required by law to be decommissioned. And there's money set up ahead of time in an escrow kind of fund for paying the costs of dismantling and removing, big old power plants and recovering the land to a usable condition. We didn't used to do that. We didn't even start thinking about these kinds of obligations to do cleanup and reclamation until the 1970s. And so it's just been a couple of generations that we've even paid any attention at all to what do we do with stuff that's worn out. I think that that's kind of probably the main obstacle. Technology is already there. I mean, clean energy is already more efficient and cheaper than the legacy energy systems. And the transformation is being driven by that fact. Market factors are driving coal out of the market, not tree huggers, not policies, not climate, concern. It's the market. If you can generate the same number of kilowatt hours for 15 or 20% less with solar and wind, why wouldn't you do that? Well, the only reason we can't move faster is that we have to restructure and redesign the whole energy system to take this new kind of power, which goes back to a question somebody else asked. What are those limitations to how much renewable energy we can adopt? And some of that limitation is storage. That problem is being solved technologically, but we still have, there's a lot of cultural resistance. The Navajo Nation resisted the closure of that coal plant for like 2 years after it was announced that the plant was closing. Instead of, embracing change and trying to figure out how to move forward, they had so much invested in that plant and so many families were dependent on it that there was a whole lot of time and effort expended trying to keep the plant from closing down. That's going to happen all over North America. But the plant closings are inevitable and they're coming rapidly. And I think it would be much smarter for us to figure out how to move forward together and bring everybody along and design a new and better system.
Well, and to that point, I mean, and this may be for Paul and Ed, but I totally agree with you, Paul. And one of my great frustrations in watching what's occurred on the Navajo Nation and the Hopi Nation with these closures is that they really have not been given enough time to plan. The utilities, I mean, in the case of NGS, the utilities basically gave the Navajo Nation 4 months. That's ridiculous. And yet, I think an analogy would be for this situation in American history is the military base closure process, right? The BRAC process. Well, in that case, we gave communities lots of time to plan. There was lots of process, lots of community stakeholder efforts. So, I guess that one of our audience members asked, what are the legislative, are there any legislative actions or commission actions going on this issue? But let me start with both of you or all of you. Why haven't we done a better job of planning for this? And what are the current legislative or corporation commission efforts around just transitions? And I can help with the second part of that question if you guys would like. So Ed, what do you think?
Let me go ahead and start. Hey, I want to kind of tail off what Paul just said with respect to some of the challenges being political, cultural, governance, what have you. But so there's about 300 of us that are tuned into this film. And so you kind of have to step back, at least I do step back. There is a number of us who subscribe to sustainability, environmental science, sensitivity. So obviously we're here. And then also the Navajo Nation has its own NGOs out there that really advance this conversation. But the lay person out there, your regular everyday Navajo, I think one of the biggest piece is education. You can do all the political might and presentation that you may have, but it's your lack of education, your lack of connection to the lay Navajo person. I think that's where some of the disconnect has been in terms of why would you have these challenges out there. So having said that, to the next question is, I think one of the things that needs to happen, that which we all are part responsible, is really embracing the need for this just transition. I know I have my responsibilities working with the Navajo Nation government, and I do what I can, but there's only so much that you can do within one's title or one's office or one's channel of communications. I think combining everyone's effort in a team format, making a unified front, I think that would be really helpful. Now, that's basically what my takeaway from this piece is. The Nation in Transition is to capture and to present this presentation to a much larger audience in time. And I think that's where we will get that unified front and to really push forth in, presenting a just transition for the Navajo people, Navajo leadership, Navajo Nation.
Great. Paul, you want to add to that?
Oh, I was just thinking, I was putting on my SRP board of directors hat for a minute. I served for 4 years on the board of directors of SRP. Ran in 2016 to try to help advance solar because SRP had adopted a bunch of policies that made it very, very difficult for people to put rooftop solar on their houses and gain from that benefit. So it was a kind of a short-term thing that I did, but it was one of the most interesting and educational experiences I had. That's good advice for everybody. If you want to see change, don't just wait for somebody else to bring it. Step in. It's just, all the people who make these decisions, they're just regular people. You can make a difference yourself. But thinking about your question, Kris, from the point of view of SRP, and I hope this is changing, but a lot of utility companies are afraid to announce that their legacy fossil fuel fired power plants are out of the money. They keep it close to their chest for a very long time. APS claimed that they let one community know they were shutting a coal plant down 10 years early. I can tell you that is not just highly unusual, but unprecedented. And there's a lot of coal-fired power plants out there that the owners know are shutting down, but they're afraid to tell the local community because they know it's going to be a bombshell. It's really devastating. And so a lot of them will wait till the last minute. And as you pointed out, Kris, then there's not enough time for that community to really organize and prepare for the transition. In some cases, they'll say, oh, we're going to close this plant down in 2032, like they're doing for a couple other coal plants in northwestern New Mexico, also on the border of the Navajo Nation. One of those plants is supposed to close down in 2032. I bet, a month's salary that it's going to close down 5 years before that, if not even sooner. We need clear and open and honest communication about this if we're going to be able to design a just transition. And so that's one responsibility of utilities.
Well, and indeed, Paul, President Nez often says in publicly and in conversations I've had with them, look, I don't want any Arizona or New Mexico community to ever experience what the Navajo Nation had to experience with the closure of NGS. I don't want, and he talks about Springerville because obviously Springerville is now slated for closure, and that community in Arizona is going to go through the same thing the Navajo Nation has had to go through. And he is very passionate about wanting to make sure that these communities have time to plan. And for him, that meant 5 years at least, not 4 months. Let me ask another question to the panel from an audience member, which was, how do we make sure that that the Navajo Nation doesn't experience the same thing it experienced with the closure of coal plants when we get into the renewable energy transition with renewable energy projects, i.e., how do we make sure that the benefits of renewable energy projects go to the Navajo Nation? One of the themes of the film was we had all this massive infrastructure. I think Nicole Horseherder and Delegate Slater talked about this from the movie. We had all this massive infrastructure on the Navajo Nation. We used their water, their airshed, their labor, and yet they didn't really reap the benefits. So how do we not repeat that mistake going forward? I'll throw that to anyone who wants to answer it.
Go ahead, Ed, and then I'll follow you up.
Okay, thank you, Kris. Thank you, Paul. So what comes to mind is human capital investment. This concept of natural capital investment or reinvestment. The idea that you train your Navajo people, your Navajo workforce, train them to where they maintain the skills, and the skills then are advanced to the next generations. And part of that is, of course, a massive investment, not only in education, but in infrastructure and maintaining those education within, in this case, the two institutions on Navajo Nation, Diné College or Navajo Technical University. Make that as a hub to begin your investment so you have a workforce for generations to come. That's one. In terms of renewable energy, the second thing is also understanding, again, the NGOs have really done a great job in some of these areas, but really understanding what I think Delegate Slater talked about in the movie, which is, look, the cultural, religious investment, some of it have been waived, if you will, by not understanding and not appreciating, not embracing these principles. I think that's got to be part of the stewardship of taking care of Mother Earth. That has to be part of this investment. And so you got to start local and start using the institution on the nation as a vehicle to advance this investment long term. So that would be my short answer here. Paul?
Yeah, Ed, your first answer about native renewables, that's why we made sure that we went and interviewed Suzanne Singer and at their training session, is because of the critical importance in a just transition of workforce retraining. There's funding available for workforce retraining in both the New Mexico and the Colorado Just Transition Acts that were passed in 2019 to facilitate this transition. They included local economic development and workforce retraining, because that's so crucial. Delegate Slater also mentioned that this is an enormous opportunity, and that really gets to the heart of the question. Why would it be different in a renewable energy regime than it was in the old fossil fuel regime? And here's the best way to explain that. That coal-fired power plant, Navajo Generating Station, that shut down, it generated 2.2 gigawatts of energy. It was a gigantic centralized generating station that sent electricity throughout the Southwest, all the way to Los Angeles. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power was one of the co-owners of that plant, taking electricity all the way from the Navajo Nation. That kind of super large centralized energy generation system requires a lot of capital, a lot of time to build. It takes about 10 years to build a coal-fired power plant. It takes 30 years to pay the damn thing off before you start earning, a free and clear profit. It has a lot of maintenance costs, and it's got to have enormous amounts of coal sent to it for fuel. The investment to create one of those things required outside capital, international, monetary instruments, stock markets and giant corporations. It's not something that can be homegrown. Now compare that to a 1 megawatt solar array, which should be enough to, provide power for, say, 1,000 homes or more. You can put solar anywhere, and you can scale it. So you can build, 30 panels one year, and then 60 more the next year, and then 100 more the next year as you need that power and as you have that capital. So renewable energy development, particularly solar, can be locally developed and locally owned in a way that the old legacy system never could. So for coal to develop on the Navajo Nation, it had to be outside companies coming in with outside capital and outside expertise. And of course, in a capitalist system, those companies are going to take most of the benefits away with them. But the Navajo Nation is in a position now where it can develop its own resources, solar resources, renewable energy resources, with much of their own capital, generating local income, training local jobs, and making sure that the benefits, as many as possible of those benefits, stay locally. That's an opportunity we have with the renewable energy system that we did not with the previous system.
I want to jump back. Thank you, Paul. I want to jump back to the policy question, what's going on from a policy standpoint, because we also have a question from the audience on what the Biden administration can do. And I did notice with great interest that President Biden, in his first slew of executive orders, did mention the need to help coal impacted communities through this transition, which I thought was great. And I think he has assigned that to his White House climate czar, Gina McCarthy. But I'll lay out a couple things that I know are going on at the Corporation Commission that are in the right direction. The commission is addressing this in the APS and TEP rate cases. The Navajo Nation led the charge on intervening in that case and has proposed a number of things, including that $100 million fund for transition for the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation did, as I said, negotiate the 600 megawatts of renewable energy projects for the nation from APS. And the Hopi Nation has also intervened before the Arizona Corporation Commission. And then finally, there's a movement afoot to try to encourage the utility to utilize something called securitization of these coal plant assets that would then throw off funding for these communities, whether it's the Navajo Nation or eventually Springerville. Paul, do you want to add to that, or Ed, and maybe even speak to the Biden administration or what the Biden administration can do?
Well, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, but I would like to note that the other co-founder of Native Renewables, besides Suzanne Singer, is a woman named Wahala Johns, who was just appointed head of the Office of Indian Energy in the US Department of Energy by the Biden administration. So there is a Navajo clean energy activist who is now running the Office of Indian Energy and will be in a position to be able to help advance the development of clean energy on tribal lands throughout the United States. That's good news. Also, the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, is a Pueblo of Zuni member from New Mexico who is very familiar with all of the challenges of coal mining and coal-fired power plants in Northwest New Mexico, and very familiar with the concept of a just transition for affected communities as we shift from coal to renewables. And so we're going to have two key indigenous leaders from the Southwest in the Biden administration pushing forward the policies that we need.
We had a question also in the chat from someone wanting to know what they can do to get involved in this, especially as a grad student. But let me throw it to Roger, and because we also had a question on what is the plan for the distribution of this film? What's next steps for you, Roger? It seems to me this film is so incredibly important because it's our opportunity to really get this message out to the general population that this is happening. I just believe in my heart that, and in my gut, that most Arizonans don't know this is happening. And if they did, they would care deeply about this. And they would agree with Delegate Slater that, and frankly, the representative from APS, which I thought was a great statement by them, that we owe a debt of gratitude to the Navajo Nation. So Roger.
Yeah, thank you, Kris. You know, one thing I often think about is this concept of a strategic narrative. And it's a term that I picked up from some military strategists that I came across years ago when I was doing another film on the military's transition to renewables. And really, it's a simple term. I mean, for me, it just simply means that it's a story that everyone can relate to in their daily lives. You know, it's hard to come up with a story that everyone can relate to in their daily lives, but energy certainly is one. And when we put this in terms of basic human need, then we can see how the narrative really just cuts across every, not even just sector of our country, but every culture around the world. And so I think it's a human story. And one thing, you know, I'm really trying to do, you know, I'm not an energy policy expert. I'm so glad that Paul and Ed and you, Kris, are here to help answer the more technical and policy related questions. But what I'm really trying to do is democratize this experience for people. And I borrow that term from an advisor of mine, Eric Martin, who wrote a great book called Democratizing Leadership. And it's something I think a lot about. I'm not trying to make people into filmmakers. I'm trying to give people the tools to tell their own stories and communicate more effectively. And I think, you know, in our culture nowadays, people avoid difficult conversations. You know, the classic example is, you know, you don't talk politics at Thanksgiving. I'm trying to turn that on its head so that we can find a way to talk politics at Thanksgiving, but to do it the right way. And that means showing up with an understanding of what is it this other person cares about. I might disagree with this person. I might, some of their choices in life might repel me, but I know that there's some commonality that we share. And if you're committed to discovering what that is, and then honing the communication skills to make a bridge to that person, you know, try not to be naive here, but I really think that there's a tool here, that this film is a tool for you to go out there and have this conversation with people. I mean, really, this concept of democratizing leadership is finding the difficult conversation and having the difficult conversation. It takes work, it takes courage, but it's definitely not rocket science, and it's definitely not even energy policy as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, that's what I hope people will do is, you know, pick up on the themes in this film and then look for opportunities wherever they might be. Maybe it's the water cooler or the virtual water cooler at your office. And just, try to talk to people about the things they care about in terms that will really unite us around this common purpose.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Roger, we have a link to the American Resilience Project in the chat. That's at www.amresproject.org. And we'll also be linking to the movie from our new Just Energy Transition Center website, which is globalfutures.asu.edu/just energy. So you can get the movie in a couple different places. For those who didn't see it beforehand, let's get this movie widely viewed.
And if I could just jump in with a shameless plug that needs to be made, which is that we have a number of these other films that are in the pipeline, and we are a nonprofit, so we are seeking donations and grants. So you can donate to us through the amresproject.org website.
Yes, please, everyone do that if you can. These movies, if you haven't seen Roger's other films, they are fantastic. And he's going to continue making them if we can help him do that. Paul, did you want to say something?
Yeah, if I can reemphasize, Roger's company is a not-for-profit company, not a commercial for-profit company, and so that's important for two ways. Number one, we need to raise money from supporters and philanthropists who like to see this educational work being done. But number two, Roger doesn't charge that much, sometimes nothing at all. For you to be able to show this film. We want this film to be widely shared. And if any of you on the call are involved with any organization that you think would like to host a showing, we will make it available to you without charge. And we will also provide you some tools for discussions afterwards, for additional resources to learn more, and for ways to get engaged. Both Kris's Just Energy Transition Center and Roger's American Resilience Project will have links to educational resources. We're creating what's called we're calling a public engagement toolkit that will have resources available for people who are, just citizens trying to make a difference, policymakers, municipal leaders, business leaders, educators, anybody. We're going to try to create tools that will allow you to take this film and take it to the next level of engagement with your own communities and your own organizations. And there's not going to be any barriers to doing that. So please take advantage of this.
We still have a few minutes left in the hour. So if I could end with a couple of additional substantive questions that came in through the chat that I think are really important. One person asked a question about the renewable energy, developing renewable energy projects on a sovereign nation, and how can you speak to the issue of sovereign immunity or sovereignty in building renewables on tribal land? Ed, do you have any insights on that? Because that is an interesting question, and a little bit different than when you're developing renewables on privately owned land.
Okay, Kris, thanks for the question. Hey, so earlier before the filming, I had a chance to have a brief conversation with Delegate Slater. I presume he's online listening. So one of the things that he mentioned was a framework. The nation, whether you're talking from the President Nez's side or the Speaker's side, really for the moment lacks a framework, and what he called a principle framework. And I think that's one of the leading things that needs to be adopted, embedded, accepted, and put out there, so that will then convey the message with respect to sovereignty, political sovereignty, as well as cultural sovereignty to these renewable energy companies. And they're basically standing at the door of Navajo Nation, knocking on doors, whether in Natural Resources Department, the President's office, the Speaker's office, and any number of delegates, even our office. And when we put together a sustainability symposium here about a year and a half ago, a lot of them were there. And so that question continues to come up, is how do we come onto a sovereign nation and put together, at least put a bid out there what President Nez talks about is there's really no clearinghouse. They talked about adopting an energy house, which was part of the 7-3 legislation I spoke about. That legislation fizzled out. So these delegates are aware, as well as President Nez, that there needs to be a renewed energy policy that speaks uniquely and purposely with targets to renewable energy. And I think that's where we're going in terms of that. That's where Navajo Nation leadership is going, is adopting a framework with principled statements of how to bridge that gap. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Ed. You know, and then the other substantive question that I thought that I'd throw out there, and maybe this is to you, Paul, but what is the timeline? Twofold question. What is the timeline for a just energy transition, whether it's for the Navajo Nation or any other coal impacted community like Springerville? And how do we judge success? You know, 15 years from now, when all of these coal plants are shut down, and they will all be shut down essentially within, I think, 15 years. It's happening at a blinding pace really across the country. How do we judge success for these communities and all of us in helping these communities make this transition?
Good question. I think one way of judging success would be to see down the road whether communities have viable economic options and can maintain their tax base and maintain their services, maintain their jobs base. There's going to be a really rocky period at the beginning, and a bunch of people are going to lose jobs as new job opportunities come in, and it's going to be messy. There's going to be a lot of pain. But if we look back at it 2 years later, 3 years later, we can judge how successful that transition was after you get through the bumpy part by whether the community is doing as well or better than it was before. And I always think back, I spent a lot of time in Southeast Arizona. I spent 17 years in Tucson. And I remember back in the 1980s in Tucson, that was a period, the 80s was a period in which a whole bunch of gigantic open pit copper mines were shutting down all over the American West, North America, all the way up to Canada and all the way down into Latin America. But Arizona had like 5 gigantic open pit copper mines with, you know, hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of people employed in them. And the price of copper plummeted, and it became more and more difficult to be profitable. And one after another, these copper mines shut down. There's a really big copper mine in Bisbee in Cochise County and a giant smelter in Douglas, just about 10, 15 miles away, that smelted that copper. And there were a lot of, those two communities were, they thought, entirely dependent on that copper mine and that smelter. And everybody kept saying for 10 years, as the economics got worse and worse and worse, economic analysts and policymakers and local, you know, chambers of commerce were saying, this is our lifeblood. We can't let it go. We've got to keep it open. And inevitably it shut down and the smelter was removed. And there was a reporter for the Arizona Daily Star in Tucson who covered that whole period, the controversy over the closure, what happened to the town of Douglas after the smelter shut down. And it was pretty devastating. 1 year later, new businesses were moving in at a rapid clip, and Douglas, Agua Prieta, Mexico, Douglas is a border town, became one of the new key corridors for trade between the US and Mexico. And 3 years later, the economy was better in Douglas, Arizona, than it was when the smelter was running. And nobody predicted that. So we can't know the future. And there are ways of making communities whole and finding new pathways forward. We just have to, you know, focus on it and do what we can to facilitate that. Those of us who are on the outside and have access to policymakers and resources, we need to keep reminding everybody that these communities were important to us. They are important to us today and will be important to us in the future. And we need to pay attention to managing the transition in a just and sustainable way.
Yeah, and never ever give up. Never leave these communities behind.
Persistence pays.
Exactly. Ed, what does a just transition, a successful just transition, look like for the Navajo Nation in 2035?
In 2035, a just transition. Basically, I really like what Nicole in the piece here said about towards the end of the film. It's not about us, it's about our children. It's looking into our children's eye and say, look, with a good conscience, have I at least handed you some tools, some education, some principles, some understanding? I think that's fundamental here in terms of educating the youth to make a just transition. So 2035, that's about, I don't know, 12, 13 years from now, is basically having them the tool set and toolkits and knowledge in their side. Say, look, we now can handle this, and we've gotten away from coal or other fossil fuel related energy. So that's basically what a just transition would look like to me. Thank you.
Roger, as the filmmaker and the artist behind this film, what do you think, and do you have any closing thoughts for us?
I mean, for me, I think, a just transition is one in which we're all conversant in what it means to us, and we should all be able to answer that question. And I think part of my mission is applying my skill set as a filmmaker to translating a lot of these very complicated questions into layperson terms. I really do want people to have the tools to have these conversations at family dinner, not just on a Zoom call with experts in the field. With all due respect to the experts, we need you. My job is to take what you do and translate. And that, again, I come back to what I said earlier, which is that we can all be those translators. And I think that is what film is really, when it's done well. I mean, any medium of communication can do this. But I think film is particularly well suited because it allows us to go into an emotional level that some of the other forms of communication that we utilize these days doesn't really reach. It's hard for a tweet or a Facebook post to really, it can have an impact in the moment, but it won't necessarily linger. And I think to break through in this media ecosystem, you really need to make that emotional connection. And so you can do that with a film, but you can also do it in one-on-one conversations. I would flag the term emotional intelligence for people. In addition to democratizing leadership, emotional intelligence, those two go together. We all have the tools and the skills to do that, no matter what field we work in, no matter what our level of education is.
Thank you, Roger. And I'll just add, I think what this film does is it is going to help us continue this conversation, continue real action on this issue. And it is going to, I think be the starting point for this statewide conversation that we really need to have. For me, a just transition for the Navajo Nation would be that not only is the Navajo Nation more prosperous in 2035 than it is today, but that it has also become a leader and a beacon of hope for the rest of the country. And I really think that the nation has that opportunity, and God willing, that will happen. So thank you, Roger Sorkin, Paul Hurt, Ed D., Arizona State University, everyone who worked on this movie. I think our time is up. Thank you especially to everyone who attended this Zoom, watched the film, and let's all stay together and work on this issue.